The bridge gave way beneath the wagon wheels with a groan like a dying ox, and Ida Wilcox had exactly half a second to decide whether to leap for the bank or go down with the planks into the churning snowmelt of Larkspur Creek. She chose the leap, but her boot caught in the wagon seat, and the deck dropped out from under her before her body had finished the thought. She did not hit water. She hit a man. Theodore Whittaker had been riding the ridge trail above the crossing when he heard the timbers crack, and he had put his gelding down the bank at a dead run without any clear notion of what he meant to do once he got there. What he did was fling himself from the saddle at the very edge of the broken span and catch 120 pounds of falling woman across his chest in one arm, the impact driving them both to the rocky bank in a tangle of wet wool and startled breath. Behind them, the wagon dropped end over end into the current, the mule already cut free of its traces by instinct or luck, scrambling up the far bank with a bray of pure outrage. For a moment neither of them moved. Ida lay against him with her bonnet gone and her dark hair come loose from its pins, and Theodore lay on his back on the cold stones with his hat crushed somewhere beneath his shoulder, and the creek roared past them not 4 feet away, brown and swollen, with a month of mountain snow going soft all at once. "You are going to want to breathe," he said, because it seemed like the thing a deputy marshal ought to say to a woman who had just gone through a bridge. "I am breathing," she said, though she was not really, and then she was, in a great gasping rush that turned into something close to a laugh. "You are Theodore Whittaker." "I am." He helped her sit up, careful of her, careful of himself, both of them soaked through the boots and one sleeve of her dress torn at the shoulder seam. "And you are Miss Wilcox from the Assay office, and your bridge just went to Sacramento without you." "It was not my bridge." She looked past him at the wreckage of planking spinning away downstream, and something in her face went very still, the humor of survival replaced by a colder arithmetic. "That span was sound in October. I crossed it with a load of ore not 3 weeks past. Snowmelt's been hard this year." Theodore got to his feet and offered his hand, and she took it, and he noted, in the practical way of a man who spent his days noting things, that her grip was firm and her palm was calloused in a line across the fingers that came from handling crucibles and tongs, not from needlework. There was a slide up at Bear Notch 2 nights back. Whole shoulder of the mountain came down into the North Fork. I expect the water's been running higher and meaner than anybody built for. I expect you are right. She pulled her hand from his, not unkindly, and began wringing water from her skirt with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had no patience for being fussed over. "I had 4 ounces of dust and a crucible of retort silver in that wagon, Mr. Whittaker, belonging to the Hargrove outfit, if you want to know whose temper I will be facing when word gets around. I will fish what I can out of the shallows below the bend before dark," he said. "Iron and silver do not float far in that current. They will have gone down where the water slows. You would do that. I am the deputy marshal of this district, Miss Wilcox. Recovering property is a fair part of the job." He picked up his ruined hat, considered it, and set it on his head anyway, dripping. "Though I will confess I would have gone in after that or even if I wore no badge at all. A man does not like to see honest work drowned." She looked at him properly then, for the first time since the fall, taking in the line of his jaw and the steadiness in his eyes, and the fact that he had thrown himself down a creek bank without a moment's hesitation for a woman he had, until that instant, known only by reputation and by the sign over her door. Larkspur Crossing was not a large town. Everyone in it knew Ida Wilcox ran the Assay office alone, had run it alone for the 1.5 years since her father's heart gave out over his own scales, and everyone knew Deputy Marshal Whittaker had buried a wife 2 winters back and had not so much as danced with another woman since. The town had opinions about both of them, as towns will, and had mostly agreed that neither one was available for anything beyond good morning and good evening. "Thank you," Ida said, "for the catching." "You are entirely welcome," he said, "for the catching," and something passed between them that was not quite a smile and was not quite anything either of them was prepared to name, standing wet and shivering on a creek bank while the last board of the bridge vanished around the bend. They walked into town together, leading his horse, since her mule had bolted for its own stable and would need retrieving later, and by the time they reached the Main Street half of Larkspur Crossing had already heard some version of the story, most of them wilder than the truth. Ida did not correct the versions that had Theodore Whitaker diving into raging floodwater to save her from certain death. She found, to her own private surprise, that she did not entirely mind them. Larkspur Crossing sat where a wagon road from Sacramento met the foothill diggings, a town built fast and cheap in the gold years and now, 3 seasons past the first great rush, settling into something more permanent and more complicated. The placer gravels along the creeks had thinned, and the men who stayed were mostly the ones who had sunk shafts into quartz ledges or turned to cattle on the rolling grass country below the timberline. And the ones who had not stayed had left behind empty cabins and a scattering of graves, and in a few cases, debts that other men were only too glad to collect on. Ida's Assay office stood at the center of all of it, a narrow frame building with a false front and a sign her father had painted himself. WILCOX Assaying, gold and silver, honest weight. Inside, the shelves held crucibles and cupels, and a set of balance scales so precise they could weigh a fingernail's worth of difference. And behind the counter, Ida kept a ledger that recorded not just the ounces and the fineness of every man's dust and nuggets, but in her own private shorthand scrawled in the margins, a good deal else besides. She knew whose claim was paying and whose was played out. She knew which rancher had borrowed against next year's cattle, and which prospector had started cutting his dust with brass filings to make it weigh heavier than it assayed, a foolishness she caught within a week and never once mentioned to another living soul, because a woman who ran an assay office alone in a mining town survived by being trusted absolutely, and trust of that kind was not compatible with gossip. Men told her things across that counter they would not have told a priest. She had become, without ever intending it, the quietest and best-informed person in Larkspur Crossing. Theodore Whitaker knew all of this in the general way that a deputy marshal knows the shape of his town, but he did not know, until the week after the bridge, just how much of it lived behind Ida Wilcox's calm gray eyes. He came to her office 3 days later with a leather pouch of ore in his coat pocket and a question he had turned over most of the night before asking it. "I want an honest assay," he said, setting the pouch on her counter, "and I want it kept quiet until I say otherwise." Ida untied the pouch and tipped a handful of crushed quartz into her palm, rock shot through with threads of yellow that even an untrained eye would have recognized as promising. She did not look up. "Everything that crosses this counter is kept quiet, Mr. Whitaker, unless the owner chooses to shout it from the church steps himself. That is the whole of my trade. I know it. I am asking anyway because this one matters more than most." She glanced up at that, taking his measure the way she took the measure of ore, patient and unhurried. "This is your claim, the one up past Coyote Bar. You have heard of it." "I have heard 3 different stories of it in the last 2 weeks, which is 2 more stories than a claim usually earns before it either pays or does not." She set the sample on her scale, then reached for her mortar to begin crushing a working portion finer, her hands moving through the motions with an economy that came from 10,000 repetitions. "One story says you have struck a rich vein of free gold in a ledge nobody else troubled to prospect, because it sits on land your late wife's family held before the courts sorted the title. Another says you have salted that ledge with dust bought cheap off a broke miner, meaning to sell shares to fools before anyone can prove different. And a third says you are only doing what every deputy marshal in California does on his day off, which is dig a hole and hope." Theodore's jaw tightened, but he did not look away from her. "Which story do you believe?" "I do not believe stories, Mr. Whitaker. I believe scales." She began the roasting process, laying a portion of the crushed ore into a small clay cupel and setting it into the muffle at the back of her forge, the little brick furnace her father had built with his own hands and that she tended now like an altar. "Give me the better part of an hour, and I will tell you what your rock actually holds, and no story at all will change the number I write in this ledger." He waited. She worked. And Theodore Whitaker, who had come in armored against whatever answer she might give him, found himself instead watching the way she moved through the cramped little office, utterly certain of every motion, the flame of the forge throwing gold light across her face as she checked the crucible's heat by eye and by the particular smell of the flux, adjusting the bellows without seeming to think about it at all. There was something in the sight of a person doing hard, precise work with total competence that struck a man harder than any amount of beauty alone could have managed, and Theodore, sitting on the bench along her wall with his hat in his hands, felt something shift loose in his chest that had been locked down tight since the winter he buried Clara. "You are staring," Ida said, without turning around. "I am admiring craft," he said. "There is a difference." "Is there?" She lifted the cupel with her tongs, examined the small button of metal left after the lead had absorbed the base impurities and been driven off, and set it on her scale with the careful reverence of a woman handling the truth itself. She weighed it, made a note, weighed a second control sample, made another note, and then looked up at him with an expression he could not immediately read. "Well, your ore runs better than fair. Call it 11 ounces to the ton at this grade, which on a ledge of any size would make you a wealthy man inside 2 years." She set down her pencil. "It is also entirely consistent with itself. Free gold, worn edges from being carried in solution through that particular quartz, trace silver content that matches every other sample I have ever pulled from the Coyote Bar Formation, going back to when my father first assayed rock from that district in 1850. If someone salted this, Mr. Whitaker, they did it with gold mined from the exact vein you claim to have found it in, which would be a strange kind of fraud for anybody to bother committing." The breath went out of him slow, like a man setting down a weight he had been carrying so long he had stopped noticing the ache of it. "You are certain?" "I have been assaying ore since I was 9 years old and tall enough to reach the balance beam standing on a crate. I am certain." She untied her apron and hung it on its peg, and for the first time that morning she let herself really look at him, at the relief plain on his face, at the 2 days' growth of beard. He had not bothered to shave because whatever accusation he was fighting had eaten at his sleep. "Who is saying otherwise, and why does it matter enough to bring you here before you have had your coffee?" He told her then, sitting on her bench with his hat turning slowly in his hands. His claim sat on 40 acres above Coyote Bar that had come to him through Clara's family. Land nobody had thought worth much until he found color in a ledge the old-timers had walked past for 3 years running. He had filed proper, recorded the claim at the district office, done everything according to the letter of a law he was sworn to uphold, and within a month a man named Silas Corwin had begun quietly suggesting, to anyone who would listen over cards or whiskey, that the deputy marshal's sudden good fortune looked considerably less like providence and considerably more like a swindle in the making. "Corwin," Ida said, and something closed in her face like a door. "You know him." "Everyone in this town knows Silas Corwin. He holds the note on half the ranches between here and the river, and he has been buying up claims at half their worth from men too discouraged to work them any longer. I know him the way I know a rattlesnake sunning on a path. I do not need to have been bitten to know to step around him. He has not threatened me outright. He is too careful for that. But he has been talking to Angus Hargrove and Patrick Callahan both, and those two families have hated each other since before I wore this badge, and the talk I am hearing now is worse than any I have heard before. Fences cut. A well gone bad on the Hargrove side, and the Callahans blamed for it, though I cannot find a shred of proof either way. If this keeps building, it will end in men shooting each other over a strip of pasture, and I do not know how to stop it, because every road I walk down to find the truth seems to lead back to Silas Corwin standing at a comfortable distance, wringing his hands and offering to buy out whichever family breaks first." Ida was quiet a long moment, turning the shape of it over the way she turned or over in her mind, before committing a number to the ledger. "He came in here 2 weeks past," she said slowly, "wanting me to assay a sample he said came off Hargrove land, up where their creek runs down off the ridge. Wanted to know if there was color enough up there to be worth a man's trouble to dam it for himself upstream of the ranch. I told him what the sample showed, which was next to nothing, ordinary tailings, and he thanked me kindly and left, and I thought no more of it. But if he is thinking about that creek, Mr. Whitaker, and your claim sits on the very same watershed above Coyote Bar, then whoever controls the water controls both ranches below it," Theodore finished, and the two of them looked at each other with the particular understanding of two people who have just watched the same puzzle box turn over and reveal its false bottom. And a deputy marshal with a clean, rich, legally filed claim sitting right in the middle of that watershed is an inconvenience to a man who would rather see the land change hands quietly, through debt and disgrace, than have the law taking any close interest in who is diverting what. "You need to prove your claim is honest where more people than me can hear it," Ida said. "And I think you need to find out exactly what Silas Corwin intends to do with that water before the Hargroves and the Callahans finish killing each other over a drought he is causing on purpose." Theodore stood, settling his ruined hat back on his head, and for a moment he simply looked at her, this woman who had assayed his ore and in the same quarter hour, assayed the whole shape of the trouble bearing down on his town with a clarity he had not managed in 2 weeks of turning it over himself. "I would be obliged," he said, "for your help in seeing this through." "You will have it," she said, and did not examine too closely why the offer came so readily to her lips, for a man she had known, properly, for less than a week. Spring deepened over the following days, and with it came the particular danger of the season that every foothill family understood in their bones, whether they had lived through one Sierra winter or 20. The snowpack above Larkspur Crossing had come in heavy that year, deeper than any old-timer could recall, and now the days were warming fast, and the mountain was letting go of its weight all at once. Twice more that week Theodore rode out to check reports of slides, once a modest slip of mud and rock that had taken out a stretch of fence on the Callahan side, and once a genuine avalanche off the shoulder of Bear Notch that thundered down a gully 2 miles from the nearest cabin and left a scar of splintered pine visible from the town itself. Men spoke of it over supper with the particular hush reserved for things too large and too indifferent to argue with. The mountains did not care whose claim was honest or whose fence needed mending. They simply came down when the weight grew too great to hold and swept away whatever stood in the path. Ida understood that danger better than most in town, though she rarely spoke of why. Her mother had died in just such a slide, 11 years past, on the road down from a mining camp in the northern diggings, buried in an avalanche that took the wagon and 2 mules and left 9-year-old Ida and her father to make the rest of the journey to Larkspur Crossing alone, with nothing but the scale and the crucibles they had managed to salvage from the wreck. Her father had built the assay office as much as a monument to that loss as a livelihood, weighing gold with the same unbending precision he might have applied, had fate allowed it, to weighing the fairness of the world that had taken his wife. Ida had grown up inside that precision. She trusted it the way other women trusted Scripture. It was this same precision that undid the fragile new trust between her and Theodore Whitaker, not 2 weeks after the bridge, and undid it in a way that frightened her far more than the collapse of any span of timber ever could. A boy named Sammy Doyle came running to the assay office on a Tuesday afternoon, breathless, 12 years old and thin as a fence rail, the son of a line rider named Watt Doyle who worked the Callahan spread and had lost his wife to fever the winter before. Sammy swept the office floor most mornings for a few pennies and the occasional stick of peppermint candy, and Ida had come, without quite planning it, to think of him as something between an employee and a stray. She had adopted the way one adopts a barn cat, feeding him more than his work strictly earned, and pretending not to notice when he pocketed a biscuit for later. "Miss Wilcox," he said, gasping, "there's men up at the marshal's office saying Deputy Whitaker's claim is salted for certain, and they've got a sample to prove it, and Mr. Corwin's saying it right out loud on the street, and folks are believing him." Ida untied her apron so fast the strings tangled, and walked the 2 blocks to the marshal's office at a pace just short of running, arriving to find a small, ugly crowd gathered in the dusty street outside, Silas Corwin at its center in his good black coat, holding up a small vial of gold dust for anyone who cared to look. "I mean the man no ill will," Corwin was saying, in the reasonable, regretful tone of a man who enjoyed nothing so much as appearing reasonable and regretful while doing considerable harm. But when a man finds a fortune sitting on land his own family disputes, and files it quiet, and will not let any one independent look at the ledge itself, a fellow starts to wonder. "I had this sample from a prospector who worked that same ground before Whitaker filed. Take it to Miss Wilcox yourselves if you doubt me. Let her tell you plain whether that ore matches what the deputy has been showing around town." Theodore stood on the steps of his own office with his hands loose at his sides, and a stillness about him that Ida recognized, having seen it once already on the creek bank, as the particular calm of a man holding himself very carefully together in front of witnesses. He looked at her as she came through the crowd, and something in his eyes asked her, without a word spoken, to trust him one more time. She took the vial from Corwin's hand without comment, walked it back to her office with half the street trailing after her out of curiosity, and performed the assay in full view of anyone who cared to crowd into her small workroom and watch, which by the time she finished numbered perhaps a dozen men, including Angus Hargrove himself, drawn by the noise, his weathered face set in the flat suspicion of a man who had already decided which way he wanted the truth to point. The fire assay took the better part of an hour, and Ida performed every step of it with a deliberate, unhurried clarity meant to leave no man in that room to doubt her methods, narrating each stage the way her father had taught her to do for nervous claim owners who did not trust what they could not see. When she weighed the final button of gold and set it beside her earlier notes on Theodore's original sample, her stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the numbers in front of her. The vial Corwin had produced assayed richer even than Theodore's own sample, and it carried, buried in the fineness of it, a whisper of platinum grains she recognized from long habit. Platinum turned up in gold from certain northern river gravels, the Feather and its tributaries, in a signature so distinctive that any assayer who had handled enough northern dust learned to spot it by color and weight alone. It was not a signature that belonged anywhere near the Coyote Bar quartz ledges, where the local gold ran clean and free of any such trace, which meant the sample in that vial had never come from Theodore's claim at all. It had come from somewhere else entirely, carried south and passed off as local ore. It was proof of fraud, but not proof of whose fraud, and in the charged, watching silence of that crowded little office, with Angus Hargrove's eyes boring into her, and Corwin standing in the doorway with his arms folded in an attitude of patient, wounded innocence, Ida made the hardest calculation of her professional life. If she said only that the 2 samples did not match, without explaining why, the town would hear it as confirmation that Theodore's claim was the false one, since his gold, being genuinely rich, looked to an untrained eye exactly like a thing worth salting. "They do not match," she said carefully, "and I will need more time before I can tell this room whose sample is the honest one and whose is not." It was true. It was also, in the moment, a mistake, because it left Theodore standing exposed in front of the whole town with nothing but her promise of a later answer between him and ruin, and she saw, in the flicker of his face before he mastered it, that he understood exactly what she had just cost him, even as he understood why she had done it. "You could have said it plain," he told her that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and Corwin had gone off looking entirely too satisfied with the day's work. And Angus Hargrove had left muttering that a man could not trust a badge these days any more than a stranger. You could have told them the platinum did not belong. And had every man in that room hear an assayer accuse a man of fraud before she had run every test twice over and was certain past any argument. Ida's hands were not quite steady as she banked her forge for the night, and she was grateful for the excuse of the work to keep from looking at him directly. My father built this office on being right the first time, every time, because an assayer who is wrong once is an assayer nobody trusts again. I would rather you stand a day under suspicion than have this whole district lose faith in every weight and measure I have ever given them. That trust is not only mine to spend, Theodore. It belongs to every man who has ever brought his gold across that counter believing my word was as good as gospel. He was silent long enough that she finally did look up, bracing for anger, and found instead something more complicated moving behind his eyes. I understand it, he said finally. I do not like it, standing there with the whole street looking at me like I might be a thief, but I understand it, and I think I would have done the same in your place, if the trust at stake were mine to protect instead of yours. He turned his hat over once in his hands, an old habit she had already come to recognize as thinking made visible. Clara used to say I loved my badge more than I loved being liked. I expect she would have said the same of you and that forge. It was the first time he had spoken his late wife's name to her without the words coming out clipped and guarded, and Ida heard, underneath the small joke, the shape of a grief he had not yet finished carrying. I am sorry, she said, for whatever this feud cost you before we see the end of it, and I am sorry I cannot yet tell you who set that vial in Corwin's hand, though I have a fair guess, and I mean to prove it before this week is out. What is your guess? That gold came from somewhere on the Feather River drainage, which is 2 days' hard ride north of here. Whoever carried it south either works claims up there themselves, or bought it off someone who does, and either way that is not the sort of errand a man runs for free. If I can find who traveled north and back in the last month, and who among Corwin's men has coin enough to buy dust, and no claim of his own to explain where it came from, I believe we will have our answer. Theodore looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize and to feel entirely too warmed by, a kind of frank admiration that had nothing performed about it. You would make a fine deputy, Miss Wilcox. I would make a poor deputy. I have no patience for men who will not stand still to be reasoned with. She smiled, briefly, tiredly. I will make, I think, a tolerable partner in an investigation, provided you do not make a habit of standing in the street letting strangers accuse you of things while I catch up to the truth of the matter. I will endeavor, he said, to keep my ruination on a slower schedule in future. It took 4 more days to run the truth to ground, 4 days in which the feud between the Hargrove and Callahan ranches worsened by the hour. A barn burned on the Callahan side under circumstances nobody could prove, but everybody blamed on the other family. And Theodore rode out twice to stand between men with rifles who wanted very badly to settle old grievances with lead rather than law. Ida spent those same 4 days quietly working her own channel of inquiry, and it was Sammy Doyle in the end who broke it open, arriving at her office breathless once more, this time with better news. My pa says there's a fellow been riding up to the Feather River country and back twice this month, on Corwin's own horse, and paying men up there in coin for their dust instead of trading store credit like decent folks do. My pa knows him. Name of Deke Mallory. Works for Corwin doing I don't rightly know what, but pa says he don't trust him further than he could throw the man's horse. Ida sat with that name a long moment, feeling the last pieces slide into place with the satisfying click of a scale finding balance. Deke Mallory. She had seen him twice at her counter, a lean, quiet man with pale eyes who had never once brought in ore of his own, only messages and errands for Silas Corwin, and who had, now that she thought back on it, asked her an unusual number of careful questions about how an assayer might tell one district's gold from another's. She rode out that same afternoon to find Theodore, and together they carried the whole of it to Marshal Cobb Deacon in the district seat 2 hours south, a broad, patient man near 60 who had worn a badge longer than Theodore had been alive, and who listened to the full account. Ida's assay figures laid out beside him on the table, with the grave attention of a man who understood exactly what such evidence could do to a feud that was already threatening to turn to open-range war. "It is enough to question Mallory," Deacon said finally, "and enough to make Corwin sweat some if we handle it right. It is not, on its own, enough to prove Corwin himself gave the order, and until we have that, a clever lawyer will have this Mallory swearing he acted alone and Corwin walking free to try some new mischief in 6 months' time." He looked between them, taking in something in the way they stood, close but not touching, that made him almost smile despite the gravity of the moment. "I want the two of you to find where Corwin means to use that water, and I want it in writing, in his own hand if you can manage it, or in the testimony of some fellow desperate enough to talk once he sees the game is up. There is a survey camp 2 days up past Coyote Bar, at the head of that same creek that feeds both ranches. If Corwin is planning to dam or divert that water for himself, that is where the evidence will be sitting, in whatever papers his surveyors are keeping." It was, Theodore said afterward, exactly the kind of assignment a careful lawman ought to hand to 2 deputies and a wagon of provisions, not to a deputy marshal and an assayer with no proper escort beyond themselves and a borrowed rifle. Ida told him plainly that she meant to go regardless, because she alone among anyone in the district could read a survey document for signs of fraud in the recorded assays that would justify such a scheme, and because Watt Doyle, Sammy's father, knew every game trail and shortcut in that country from 20 years working the Callahan boundary line, and had offered, unbidden, to guide them up and back in half the time a stranger would need. "You do not have to come," Theodore told her the morning they set out, checking the cinch on her borrowed mare with more care than the task strictly required. "I would rather you stayed safe in town." "I would rather a great many things, Theodore Whitaker, and safety in town, while other people decide the shape of my future is not high among them." She swung up into the saddle with the easy competence of a woman who had ridden these hills her whole life, delivering ore samples and retort silver to camps too remote for freight wagons. "Besides which, you need someone who can read an assay ledger well enough to know a forged entry from an honest one, and unless you have taken up the trade in secret, that someone is me." He looked up at her, one hand still resting on the mare's neck, and there was a warmth in his face that had nothing to do with argument. "I am glad of the company," he admitted, "whatever else I might say about the wisdom of it." They rode out at first light with Watt Doyle ahead of them on a rangy buckskin, following a trail that climbed steadily out of the settled valley and into rougher country, granite outcrops still crowned with snow, the roar of meltwater loud in every gully they crossed. Sammy had begged to come and been refused, left instead in the care of the widow who kept the boarding house, and Ida had seen the boy's face fall with such naked disappointment that she promised him, before they left, a proper telling of the whole adventure once they returned, a promise that would come, in the end, to matter far more than she could have guessed that morning. The survey camp sat in a natural bowl below the ridge, 3 canvas tents and a fire ring, occupied by 2 mild, sunburned young men who worked for the State Survey Office, and who, once Theodore's badge and Ida's careful questions had established that neither of them was under suspicion themselves, proved more than willing to show their chain books and their notes. The evidence was there plain as day, once Ida knew what to look for. A proposed diversion works marked in pencil at the narrow point where the creek left the granite bowl, a dam and flume that would send the greater part of the water east into a new channel entirely, bypassing both the Hargrove and Callahan land altogether, and running instead toward a parcel of unclaimed ground that, according to the survey notes, had been quietly staked 3 weeks earlier under the name of a corporation Ida had never heard of, but that Theodore recognized at once. From papers he had seen cross his own desk, as a shell Silas Corwin had used before to hold land under a name that was not his own. "He means to dry up both ranches," Theodore said, low, reading the notes over her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back. "Let the feud finish them off fighting each other for what water is left, and then buy the dried-out land for nothing once they are both too broke and too tired to argue, and he already owns the water rights outright because he staked the new channel first, under a name nobody will trace back to him for months." "It is elegant," Ida said, with the particular bitter admiration of someone forced to acknowledge a well-constructed lie. "He does not even have to fire a shot himself. He only has to let two proud, stubborn families do the work of ruining each other, while he stands at a distance looking like the only sensible man left in the valley." They copied the relevant pages by lamplight that evening, Ida's neat, precise hand rendering the figures and the survey marks in a second notebook that would serve as evidence, while Theodore questioned the surveyors further and came away with a signed statement, given willingly enough once the young men understood the fraud they had been drawn into without their knowledge. It should have been by any reasonable accounting the end of the danger, evidence gathered, proof in hand, nothing left but the ride home and the laying of the whole scheme before Marshal Deacon. It was Wat Doyle who noticed, at first light the next morning, that they were not alone on the mountain. "Riders," he said quietly, crouched at the mouth of the bowl, studying tracks in the softened snow that had not been there the evening before. "4 of them, maybe 5, come up the main trail sometime in the night, and gone quiet again, which tells me they know we are here and are not eager to be seen approaching." Theodore's face went hard and still in the way Ida was learning meant real danger rather than the ordinary friction of town business. "Corwin knows we rode out. He would have had someone watching the marshal's office, and someone watching this camp too, likely, once his man Mallory got wind we were asking after him." He looked to Wat. "Is there any way down off this mountain that does not run back through the main trail?" Wat Doyle considered the country with the long, unhurried gaze of a man who had spent 2 decades reading it. "There is the old miner's cut, down through Widow's Gap, that most folks forgot about once the placer gravels there played out. It is steep, and half of it runs under the same slope that let go 2 weeks back in that big slide-off Bear Notch, so there is loose rock and snow bridge both to worry on. But it comes out a mile above your creek crossing, deputy, and no man who does not already know that trail would ever think to look for us on it." "Then that is our road," Theodore said. They broke camp fast. The surveyors sent off along the safer main trail with instructions to ride hard for the district seat and place their statements directly in Marshal Deacon's hands, while Theodore, Ida, and Wat Doyle struck out along the abandoned miner's path, with the pack-horse carrying their evidence and provisions between them. They had covered perhaps 2 miles of steep, treacherous going, the trail narrowing in places to a shelf barely wide enough for a horse to pass, when the canyon below them rang with the crack of a rifle shot, and Wat Doyle's horse screamed and went down. What followed happened fast, in the disjointed, adrenaline-sharp way violence always seemed to happen, according to every account Ida would later give of it. Theodore was off his horse and pulling her down behind a granite outcrop, almost before the echo of the shot had finished rolling off the canyon walls, his own rifle already coming up as he scanned the slope opposite for the shooter. Wat Doyle, thrown clear of his fallen horse, dragged himself behind a second rock with blood already darkening his shirt at the shoulder, cursing with a fluency that would have shocked Sammy had he been there to hear it. 4 of them, Theodore said, low, up on the far side, maybe 60 yards. They have the high ground and they know it. They do not know this trail, Wat Doyle gasped, gripping his shoulder. I would wager my life on it, and I suppose I am about to. Deke Mallory is a Feather River man, born and bred, and the others riding with him look like they were hired out of some saloon in the district seat. None of them have ever set foot on the old miner's cut, or they would not be sitting up there so pleased with themselves. They think they have us boxed. Ida, crouched low with her heart slamming against her ribs and the leather satchel of evidence clutched to her chest as though it were a child needing protection, found her mind working with the same cold clarity it applied to a difficult assay, sorting the panic away from the useful facts. Where does this trail actually go, Watt, if they think it dead ends here? It does not dead end. It switches back below that shelf of rock yonder, drops through a chute where the old miners used to run their tailings, and comes out below the snow bridge that slide 2 weeks back left hanging over the gully. Any man who does not know that chute is there would ride right past its mouth, because the brush has grown up thick enough to hide it from above. Then that is our way down, Theodore said. Ida, when I say move, you go for that gap in the rock, low and fast, and do not stop until you are past it. Watt, can you ride, or must we get you up behind one of us? I can ride, Watt said, through gritted teeth, already dragging himself toward Ida's mare, so long as somebody does not ask me to also shoot straight, because that shoulder is done for the day. Theodore laid down a covering fire that cracked off the canyon walls in flat, echoing reports, enough to make the men above them duck for cover and buy the space of a few seconds. And in that space Ida ran, satchel banging against her hip, boots skidding on loose scree, through the gap in the rocks, and down onto a narrow shelf of trail she would never in later years be able to fully describe without her hands beginning to shake at the memory of it. Watt Doyle came behind her, hunched low over the mare's neck, and Theodore came last, backing down the trail with his rifle still trained upward, until all three of them and the pack-horse had crowded onto the narrow chute Watt had promised, a steep, brush-choked gully that dropped away below them into shadow. The men above, realizing their quarry was slipping the trap, came scrambling and shouting down the main trail after them, exactly as Watt had predicted, riding hard along the route that any sensible man would take, straight toward the place where the trail appeared to end at a sheer drop above the gully, entirely blind to the narrow chute hidden in the brush that Theodore and Ida and Watt had already vanished into. They went down that chute at a pace Ida would later call reckless and Theodore would call necessary, sliding as much as riding in places where the footing gave way to loose shale, ducking low branches, the pack-horse squealing in protest, but game enough to follow where it was led. Above them, faintly, they heard Deke Mallory's voice raised in confused fury as his men realized the trail they had ridden down had simply stopped, the fugitives nowhere to be seen, no way forward, and from where they stood, seemingly no way down either. It was Watt Doyle's warning, shouted hoarse over his shoulder, that saved them from the mountain finishing what the ambush had failed to do. "Snow Bridge," he called. "Do not cross the flat ground below the chute. It is hollow beneath. That slide 2 weeks back left a shelf of snow over open air, and it will not hold a horse's weight. Keep to the rock on the left side. Keep to the rock." Theodore heard it and swung his horse hard left just as the ground where they would have passed let go with a soft, terrible crumple, a section of snowpack the size of a wagon bed sliding away into a black crevasse that had not existed, visibly, a moment before, swallowed under an innocent-looking blanket of white. The sound of it, a low, sighing collapse rather than any dramatic roar, was somehow more frightening to Ida than the gunfire had been, a reminder that the mountain itself, indifferent to the small human dramas of theft and ambush, could kill them just as surely and with far less warning. They came out below the gully perhaps 20 minutes later, shaken, filthy, Watt Doyle gray-faced with blood loss but alive, onto the main trail a full mile below the point where Mallory and his men had lost them, and turned their horses toward Larkspur Crossing at the fastest pace the wounded man and the tired animals could safely manage. It was full dark by the time they reached the edge of town, and it was there, within sight of the first lamplit windows, that Watt Doyle finally slid from the saddle rather than dismounting, and Theodore caught him, for the second time in this story, a catch made at the very edge of disaster, and found the wound in his shoulder had bled far more than any of them had realized in the scramble and fear of the ride. They got him to the doctor's house within minutes, but it was not enough. The bullet had done more damage on its way through than a shoulder wound ought to have done, nicking something vital that the doctor, working by lamplight with Ida holding the basin and Theodore holding the man's remaining good hand, could not fully repair. Watt Doyle died a little before midnight, quietly, without much fuss, the way Ida imagined he had likely lived, and his last coherent words were a request that somebody see to it his boy was not left entirely alone in the world. Ida was the one who told Sammy, in the gray hour just before dawn, sitting with him on the boarding house steps while the boy absorbed the news in the stunned, disbelieving silence of a child who has already lost one parent and cannot quite make his mind accept the loss of the second. She did not offer him false comfort. She simply sat with him, her arm around his thin shoulders, and let him cry, and told him, when he finally asked in a small, frightened voice what would happen to him now, that he would not be sent away, that she would see to it herself if it came to that. A promise she made before she had fully thought through what it would mean to keep it, and one she found, examining her own heart in the gray light, that she meant with her whole self regardless. Theodore found them there an hour later, having spent the intervening time first at the marshal's office rousing Cobb Deacon with the full account of the ambush and the survey evidence, and then standing a long while alone in the dark outside the doctor's house, absorbing the particular grief of a lawman who has watched a good, brave man die on a mountain trail while carrying evidence meant to save two feuding families from themselves. "I am sorry, Sammy," he said, crouching down to the boy's level. "Your father was the bravest man on that mountain today. If not for him, none of us would have come down alive." "He always said that trail was dangerous," Sammy said, in a small, cracked voice. "Said only a fool or a Doyle would use it. He used to laugh when he said that." "He was neither fool nor coward," Theodore said. "He was a man who knew his own country better than anyone else alive, and he used that knowledge to save two people who had no claim on his courage beyond having asked for his help. That is a rare thing, Sammy. You should be proud of him for the whole of your life, even while you grieve him." The boy nodded, not trusting himself to speak further, and leaned into Ida's side, and over the top of his head Theodore's eyes met hers, and in that shared look of grief and exhaustion and something else, something that had been building steadily since a bridge collapsed under a wagon 2 weeks before, Ida felt the last of her guarded reserve begin, quietly, to give way. The reckoning with Silas Corwin came 4 days later, and it came, in the end, not through gunfire or drama, but through the slow, grinding machinery of law that Theodore had sworn to serve, applied with a precision Ida recognized as very like her own trade. Marshal Cobb Deacon rode in with 2 additional deputies from the district seat, armed with the survey evidence, the surveyor's signed statements, and most damning of all, a confession wrung out of Deke Mallory within an hour of his arrest, once he understood that a charge of murder now sat alongside the fraud, since it was his shot, fired in that canyon ambush, that had ultimately taken Watt Doyle's life. Corwin tried, at first, the same reasonable, regretful performance he had given in the street outside the marshal's office weeks before, insisting he had no knowledge of any diversion scheme, that Mallory had acted entirely on his own account. It might even have worked, had Ida's meticulous assay notes not so thoroughly established the platinum-bearing gold's origin on the Feather River, matched now against Mallory's own confession of exactly where and how he had purchased it, and had the survey documents not shown, in black and white, the corporate filing that traced back, through 3 careful layers of false names, to bank drafts signed in Silas Corwin's own unmistakable hand. He was taken away in chains to await trial at the district seat, his shell corporation's claim on the water voided by the same court that had once, unknowingly, allowed it, and the diversion works never built at all. Angus Hargrove and Patrick Callahan, summoned together to Marshal Deacon's temporary headquarters in the Larkspur Crossing Hotel, and shown the full evidence of how thoroughly they had been played against each other, stood in a silence that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before Hargrove finally spoke. "I have hated your family 12 years, Patrick Callahan," he said gruffly. "Over a fence-line dispute I do not any longer entirely recall the details of. It appears we have both been made fools of by a man who never had the decency to fight us honest." "It appears we have," Callahan agreed, and after a moment, in the manner of two proud old men neither of whom quite knew how to unbend gracefully after so many years of bending in the opposite direction, they shook hands, gruffly, and agreed to share the disputed water fairly between their two ranches, a resolution that would hold, in the years that followed, far better than either family's old feud ever had. It was, Ida reflected later, a strange kind of victory, arrived at through grief and danger, and the patient unglamorous work of scales and ledgers as much as through any dramatic confrontation. And she found she preferred it that way, preferred a justice built on evidence a person could hold in their hand and weigh, quite literally, on a set of honest scales. The days that followed the trial's beginning settled into a quieter rhythm, and it was in that quiet that Ida found herself, for the first time since the bridge went out from under her wagon, with nothing urgent enough to keep her from noticing exactly how much space Theodore Whittaker had come to occupy in her ordinary days. He came to the Assay office most evenings now, not on any official business, but simply to sit on the bench along her wall while she closed up her ledgers for the night. And they talked, in the unguarded way of two people who had faced down gunfire and grief together and found each other steady through both. He told her, one evening, about Clara properly, for the first time, not as a wound he was protecting but as a person he had loved and lost. A quiet, gentle woman who had taught school in a mining camp 2 towns over before an outbreak of fever took her in a single terrible week 2 winters past, leaving him with a grief he had carried since like a stone in his boot, present in every step even when he tried to ignore it. "I did not think I would want to feel anything again after that," he admitted, turning his coffee cup slowly on her counter. "It seemed disloyal somehow to imagine caring for anyone the way I cared for her. I have spent 2 years telling myself that particular door was closed for good, and I meant it mostly, right up until a bridge fell out from under a woman I had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with, and I found myself thinking about her every day after." Ida's hand stilled on the ledger page in front of her. "I do not want to be a door you feel guilty for opening, Theodore. I have watched enough widowers in this town remarry too fast, out of loneliness more than love, and watched the second wife spend her whole life quietly competing with a ghost she can never quite outmeasure. I would rather be alone the whole of my days than spend them being weighed against a memory I have no way to answer. That is not what I am offering," he said quietly, but with a firmness that made her look up at him properly. "Clara was gentle and good, and I loved her, and I grieve her still, and none of that will ever stop being true. But you are not a replacement for her, Ida. You are your own entire person, sharper and braver and more stubborn than any woman I have ever known, and I do not love you because you remind me of her. I love you because of every single thing that makes you nothing like her at all. I love the way you stood in that canyon with a bullet satchel of evidence clutched to your chest, working out the safest line down a mountain while men shot at us, because your mind simply does not know how to stop being useful even when it is terrified. I love that you told a whole street of men you needed more time before you would speak an unproven accusation, even knowing it would cost me standing. I do not want a second version of my first marriage, Ida. I want the entire particular truth of you, exactly as you are." Ida sat very still for a long moment, the forge banked low and warm behind her, the ledger forgotten under her hand, and felt something in her chest that had been braced tight since the day her mother died in an avalanche on a mountain road finally, carefully, begin to unclench. "I have spent my whole life," she said slowly, being certain that if I simply worked precisely enough, weighed everything carefully enough, I would never be caught by surprise the way that Mountain caught my mother, the way grief caught my father in the end too, sitting over his own scale with his heart giving out and no warning at all. I built this whole life, this whole trade, around the idea that if I could just measure things exactly enough, I would never be blindsided by loss again. And then a bridge went out from under my wagon, and a man caught me before I had time to measure a single thing about him, and I have not been able to make my scales balance since. I am not asking you to stop trusting your own judgment, Theodore said. I am asking you to trust it enough to know that what you feel, feeling it for me, is not some careless miscalculation. You have weighed me plenty, Ida Wilcox. You have weighed my ore and my conduct and my character over these past weeks with more rigor than most juries manage in a proper trial. I do not think you are the sort of woman to arrive at an answer you have not already tested from every angle. She laughed then, a small, startled sound, and found there were tears standing in her eyes that she had not quite noticed forming. You are arguing your case like a man who has been coached by a lawyer. I have been coached by nobody but 2 weeks of watching you work, he said, and finding every single time that I trusted your conclusions more than my own instincts. I love you, Ida. I do not say it lightly, and I do not say it to fill some hollow space Clara left behind. I say it because it is, as best I can measure it, simply the truth. She came around the counter then, and he stood to meet her, and whatever words either of them might have added after that seemed suddenly unnecessary, and it was some while later, both of them a little breathless in the warm, ember-lit quiet of the Assay office, that Ida finally spoke again. I will not give up this office, she said firmly into the front of his shirt. Whatever comes of this of us, I will not be made into a wife who sits at home while her husband does the interesting work of the world. I intend to keep weighing ore and keeping this town's secrets until my hands are too old to hold the tongs steady. I would not have you any other way, Theodore said, and meant it entirely. I have watched you work, Ida. I fell for you across a scale and a crucible as much as across a creek bank. I am not fool enough to ask a woman to set down the very thing that first showed me who she was. There remained, in the weeks that followed, the smaller matter of Sammy Doyle, orphaned and grieving, passed for the time being between the goodwill of the boarding-house widow and whatever meals Ida could press on him at the Assay office. A boy with no family left in the district, and as inquiries eventually confirmed, no family remaining anywhere else either, his mother's people having died out or scattered years before in circumstances nobody could fully trace. Ida had made him a promise on the steps of the boarding house the night his father died, and she meant to keep it, and it was Theodore, arriving one evening to find Sammy asleep on her office bench, worn out from a day spent sweeping and restocking crucibles with a determined, grief-heavy diligence that Ida recognized as a child's way of trying to be useful enough to earn his place in the world, who finally said aloud what both of them had already been quietly deciding on their own. "We could raise him together," Theodore said, low so as not to wake the boy, "if you are willing. I have no children of my own and no prospect of family beyond whatever we build ourselves, and that boy already looks to you the way a son looks to a mother he trusts absolutely. I would be proud to give him my name, if you would be proud to give him your home." Ida looked at Sammy's sleeping face, still soft with the particular vulnerability of a child not yet fully grown into the loss he carried, and felt the decision arrive in her with none of the uncertainty that had attended so many other choices in her life. "I already promised him he would not be sent away," she said. "I only did not yet know I would have a husband to help me keep that promise." They married 3 weeks later, in a small ceremony in the Larkspur Crossing Church that the whole town turned out for regardless, partly out of genuine affection for two people they had watched pull the community back from the edge of a ruinous feud, and partly, Ida suspected, out of simple curiosity to see the town's most guarded widower and most fiercely independent businesswoman finally stand together, and say words neither had expected to say again. Sammy stood beside them at the front of the church, solemn and proud in a borrowed jacket 2 sizes too large, and when the preacher asked if anyone present had objection to the union, it was Sammy himself, entirely unprompted, who called out that he certainly did not, which brought the whole congregation to warm, startled laughter and broke whatever formal solemnity had been building in the room. Silas Corwin's trial concluded that same summer, at the district seat, with a conviction on charges of fraud and conspiracy that saw his holdings broken up and sold to satisfy his debts, much of the land returning, at fair prices this time, to the very ranching families he had meant to ruin. Deke Mallory faced a separate reckoning for the death of Watt Doyle, and though no verdict could restore what Sammy had lost, there was, Ida thought, a particular justice in the fact that the same patient, careful gathering of evidence that had once nearly wrecked Theodore's reputation had ultimately unraveled the whole scheme that killed the boy's father. Evidence built as much from her scales and ledgers as from Theodore's badge and investigation. The Hargrove and Callahan ranches shared their water peaceably from that season forward, the old feud buried alongside the last of the reasons anyone could clearly remember for having started it. And Angus Hargrove, in a gesture that surprised the whole town, gifted Sammy Doyle a young gelding that spring, saying only that a boy who had lost a father as brave as Watt Doyle deserved a decent horse to grow into. Ida kept the Assay office exactly as she had always run it, though now Theodore's hand could sometimes be found beside hers at the forge on quiet evenings, learning the trade with the same careful attention he brought to everything, not because he intended to abandon his badge but because he found, as he told her once with a rare, unguarded smile, that he simply liked watching her work closely enough to understand it, and liked being trusted with a small part of the craft that had first shown him exactly who she was. On the evening of their first anniversary, the two of them sat together on the bench outside the Assay office, watching the last light fade gold over the foothills while Sammy, 13 now and taller, exercised his gelding in the street with the particular showing-off energy of a boy who knew he was being watched fondly and did not mind it at all. The mountains above Larkspur Crossing still wore patches of old snow in their high-shadowed folds, though the worst of the season's danger had long since passed, the creeks running clear and steady now instead of wild and swollen, the bridge rebuilt sturdier than the old one had ever been, with a plaque Theodore had insisted on adding, marking simply the date of its collapse, as though to remind anyone who crossed it that even a broken thing, mended with enough care, could carry more weight afterward than it ever had before. "Do you ever think on it?" Ida asked, leaning into his shoulder, "how strange it is that a rotten bridge and a mountain slide and a wicked man's greed should have been the very things that brought us together?" "I think on it often," Theodore said, his arms settling around her with the easy familiarity of a year's practice. "I used to believe the mountains only ever took things from people. My wife's memory taught me that lesson hard enough that I built my whole life around expecting loss instead of hoping for anything else. But that same mountain, letting go the way it did, put you into my arms before either of us had the sense to look for each other on purpose. I have decided I am grateful to it, difficult as that is to admit about a pile of falling rock." "The mountain only did what mountains do," Ida said. "It was you who caught me and stayed and proved yourself honest through every hard thing that followed. That was never the mountain's doing. That was only ever you." He turned his head and kissed her then, unhurried, in the fading gold light with the creek running clear below them, and Sammy calling out something cheerful and unimportant from the street. And Ida Wilcox, who had spent so many years of her life certain that precision and careful measurement were the only defenses against a world that could take everything from a person without warning, found that she had at last, without ever quite meaning to, allowed herself to be surprised by something good. Weighed it as carefully as she had weighed anything in her life, and found it, at every measure, entirely honest, entirely sound, and entirely hers to keep.